I didn't find out my marriage was over during a fight. No yelling, no cheating confession, no slammed doors. I found out on a random Tuesday, standing in the kitchen in my socks, folding a damn towel like I had for most of my adult life. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, looking calm in a way that made my stomach tighten. And then he said, "I just want peace." That was it. That was the sentence that cracked 40 years wide open. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin today's story, a story about love, loss, and choosing myself, I ask for a small moment of your support. Please like and subscribe if these stories speak to you. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It truly means more than you know. Now, let's begin. For a second, I honestly thought he meant a quiet weekend, maybe less stress, something normal, something married people say when life feels heavy. But then he grabbed his keys, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't about rest. This was about escape. He wasn't asking for peace with me. He was asking for peace from me. The towel slipped out of my hands and hit the floor. I remember staring at it like it mattered, like it could explain something. Shock does that. Your brain latches on to stupid details because the truth feels too big to survive all at once. I was 60 years old, 60, not young enough to pretend this was just a rough patch, not old enough to stop wanting to be loved. I had built my entire adult life around this man, raised kids, paid bills, swallowed words, made myself useful, and he was standing there telling me he was done, like he was returning something that no longer fit. He didn't yell, he didn't cry, he didn't say my name much either. He said he was tired, said he didn't recognize himself anymore, said he felt like he'd been holding his breath for years. And then that word again, peace, like I'd been chaos, like I'd been the noise instead of the woman who kept the whole damn house running. People think marriages end in explosions, affairs, screaming matches, big dramatic moments. But some marriages die quietly. They die from years of, "it's fine." They die from silence. They die from one person shrinking so the other can stay comfortable. I stayed married for 40 years. I stayed when it was hard. I stayed when it was lonely as hell. I stayed because I thought that's what a good woman does. And at 60, he walked out saying he needed peace, while I stood there realizing I'd been practicing disappearance my whole life. When he left, he didn't take much: a suitcase, some clothes, his toothbrush. No speech, no long goodbye. The door clicked shut behind him, and I waited for myself to fall apart. I expected sobbing, screaming, something dramatic.
None of that happened. I just stood there in a house full of memories and felt something worse than heartbreak. I felt replaceable. That feeling didn't start that day. It had been growing quietly for years. I just didn't have a name for it yet. I married him when I was 21. Back then, I thought love meant sticking it out no matter what. I thought commitment meant endurance. I thought if I stayed loyal, patient, low maintenance, I'd be safe. That was the deal I believed in. I grew up watching women like my mother make themselves smaller to keep the peace. She never complained, never asked for more. She carried exhaustion like it was proof she was doing something right. And I learned early that being easy was safer than being honest. So I became easy. I learned his moods before I learned my own. I learned how he liked his coffee, his quiet, his evenings untouched by too much talking. I learned when to speak and when to let things slide. I learned how to say, it's not a big deal, even when it was eating me alive. There were good years, I won't lie. There was laughter, kids, holidays, shared dreams. But slowly those moments thinned out. Conversations turned into logistics. Touch turned into habit. Affection turned predictable and safe. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being a woman and became a role. Wife, mother, organizer, fixer, the one who remembered everything so nobody else had to. Nobody tells you how subtle that loss is. Nobody warns you that you won't notice it happening. You don't wake up invisible. You fade out inch by inch until one day you realize the person you built your life around barely looks at you anymore. By the time our kids were grown and the house got quieter, my thoughts got louder. I noticed how much waiting I did. Waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to ask how my day was and actually listen, waiting for some sign that I still mattered. I told myself this was normal. People say long marriages aren't exciting. They say passion fades. They say this is stability. But stability shouldn't feel like you're slowly erasing yourself. I remember one night, years before he left, we were sitting at the kitchen table. He was scrolling on his phone while I talked about something that mattered to me. He nodded without looking up and said, "That's nice." And something in me went quiet. I realized I could stop talking altogether, leave the room, disappear, and nothing would change. That was the moment I should have spoken up. That was the moment I should have said, I need more than this. But instead, I smiled, cleared the plates, told myself not to start things. I was really good at not starting things. So when he said he wanted peace at 60, part of me understood exactly what he meant. He wanted a life without emotional weight, without expectations, without having to look at the woman who'd given him everything and ask what she needed now. After he left, the house felt different, too quiet, too honest. I walked from room to room, touching things like they belonged to someone else. His chair, our bed, the table where I'd swallowed so many words. And it hit me how much of my identity had been built around him and how little of it belonged to me. The question that wouldn't leave me alone wasn't why he left, it was why I stayed silent for so long. And that question was just getting started.
I didn't tell anyone right away. Not my kids, not my friends, not even the neighbor who noticed his car was gone and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said he was traveling. It felt easier than explaining how a man can live beside you for 40 years and still leave without looking back. It felt easier than admitting I didn't know how to answer the question everyone would eventually ask. What happened? The truth was, nothing happened, and that's what made it so hard to explain. In the days after he left, I moved through the house like a ghost. I kept doing the same things I'd always done. Made the bed, washed the dishes, folded laundry. My body didn't know how to stop yet. It had been trained for decades to keep things running no matter how I felt. Muscle memory is a strange thing. It keeps you functional even when your heart is falling apart. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from our life together, like maybe I'd missed something obvious. A sign, a warning, a moment where I could have changed the ending. I kept thinking, if I could just pinpoint where it went wrong, maybe I could make sense of the way he left. But the memories didn't line up neatly. They were messy, ordinary, full of small compromises that didn't seem dangerous at the time. I remembered our early years, how young we were, how sure we thought we were. He used to reach for my hand everywhere we went, like he was afraid to lose me in a crowd. We didn't have much money, but we had plans, big ones. We talked about the future like it was guaranteed, like love was a permanent state instead of something you have to tend to. Back then, he told me I was his safe place. I didn't realize how heavy that responsibility would become. As the years passed, life filled up fast. Jobs, bills, kids, stress. We got busy surviving, and somewhere in that chaos, we stopped checking in with each other. I noticed changes before I admitted them to myself. He started coming home later, started spending more time alone, started getting quiet in a way that didn't invite conversation. I asked once if everything was okay, just once. He shrugged and said he was fine, and I let it go. That's the thing people don't talk about. How many times women sense something is off and talk themselves out of it. How often we choose harmony over honesty. How we convince ourselves that silence is strength. I told myself he was tired, that work was stressful, that marriage naturally settles into something quieter. I told myself not to be needy, not to make waves. I didn't want to be the kind of woman who complained about nothing. So I adjusted. I became easier, more accommodating, less demanding. I filled the space he left with usefulness. If I stayed busy enough, helpful enough, agreeable enough, maybe he wouldn't drift so far away. But distance doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in while you're trying to be understanding. There were moments I remember clearly now, moments I brushed off back then. Like the time I dressed up for a dinner we were supposed to go to, and he'd barely noticed. Or the way he'd listen to everyone else's stories with interest, but check out when I spoke. Or how I stopped telling him when I was hurt because it never seemed like the right time. I didn't feel unloved exactly. I felt optional. After he left, that feeling hit me all at once, like my body finally caught up to what my heart had been whispering for years. I realized how much of myself I had put on pause, waiting for him to meet me where I was. I kept asking myself if I had asked for too little or too much, if I had been too patient or not enough patient. The questions went in circles, and none of them brought peace. One afternoon, about a week after he left, I sat on the edge of the bed holding one of his shirts. It still smelled like him. I pressed it to my face and cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, exhausted tears, the kind that come from holding it together for too long. I wasn't just grieving him. I was grieving the version of myself who believed staying meant being chosen. That's when I started thinking about all the times I had made myself smaller, all the times I'd brushed off my own needs because I didn't want to rock the boat. I thought about how often I'd told myself, this is just how marriage is, instead of asking if it was how marriage should feel. I thought about how often I'd waited for permission to matter. People love to say that marriage is about compromise, and it is, but compromise only works when both people are doing it. What I'd been doing wasn't compromise. It was surrender, and I didn't even realize it until it was over. When I finally told my kids, their reactions were complicated. Shock, sadness, anger, questions I didn't have answers for. I tried to protect them even then. I said their father wasn't a bad man. I said he just needed time. I didn't tell them how deeply it hurt. I didn't want them to feel like they had to choose sides. That instinct to protect everyone else at my own expense didn't disappear overnight. But something had shifted. I could feel it. For the first time in decades, there was no one else to prioritize over myself. No one else's comfort to manage, no one else's mood to read before speaking, and that freedom was terrifying. I didn't know who I was without him. I didn't know what I liked or wanted or needed anything anymore. My life had been built around being part of a unit, and suddenly I was standing alone, wondering if I even recognized myself. There were days I missed him so much it physically hurt. Days I wanted to call him just to hear a familiar voice. Days I blamed myself and replayed every argument, every silence, every choice I made to keep the peace. And then there were moments, brief, unexpected moments, where I felt something else. Relief. It scared me at first. I felt guilty for it, like I was betraying 40 years of loyalty by admitting that part of me felt lighter. But once I acknowledged it, I couldn't ignore it. The constant tension I'd lived with, the quiet anxiety of trying not to disappoint, was gone. I wasn't happy yet, not even close, but I was breathing differently. And that's when it hit me. Maybe the peace he was chasing wasn't something he could ever find by leaving. Maybe it was something I had been denying myself all along. I didn't know what my future looked like. I didn't know how to rebuild a life at 60. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back to pretending I was okay with disappearing. That part of me was done, and the woman I was about to meet was just getting started. I keep thinking people imagine long marriages fall apart because of some huge betrayal, like one bad moment blows everything up. But that's not how it happened for us. For us, it was a slow fade, death by 1,000 paper cuts. And when I look back now, with all the noise finally gone, I can see the cracks that were there from the beginning. I just didn't want to see them at the time. When we first got married, I was young and so sure of myself in that way only a 21-year-old can be. I thought love was enough. I thought commitment meant you stayed no matter what. I didn't know yet that staying without being seen can hollow you out. He wasn't cruel. That's important to say. He wasn't some villain twirling a mustache. He was charming, responsible, steady, the kind of man people trusted, the kind of man who showed up when it mattered, just not always emotionally. And back then, I told myself that was fine. I didn't need grand gestures. I just wanted us. There were little things, even early on, moments that didn't sit right, but I brushed them off because I didn't want to seem dramatic, like how he'd shut down when conversations got emotional, or how he'd joke his way out of talking about feelings, or how if I was upset, his first response wasn't curiosity, it was irritation, like my emotions were an inconvenience instead of a signal. I learned fast that it was easier not to push. We had kids and life exploded into chaos. Diapers, school schedules, soccer games, doctor appointments. The house was always loud, always moving. And in that noise, it was easy to ignore what was missing. We were busy. Busy people don't have time to question their marriages. I became the default parent, the planner, the one who remembered everything. He was there, but I carried the emotional weight. I knew which kid was struggling, who needed extra attention, who was pretending to be okay. I held everyone's feelings like fragile glass. No one was holding mine. There were nights I lay in bed next to him, staring at the ceiling, wondering when we stopped talking, wondering when I stopped telling him things. I'd rehearse conversations in my head, thinking maybe tonight I'll say something, maybe tonight I'll tell him I feel lonely. But then I'd hear him sigh or roll over and I'd swallow it again. I told myself I was being mature, understanding, easygoing. Looking back, I was just afraid. Afraid of being told I was too sensitive, afraid of starting a fight, afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd find out the truth, that he didn't want to meet me where I was. So I adapted. I always adapted. I lowered my expectations so I wouldn't be disappointed. I told myself emotional closeness was overrated. I told myself love looked like stability, not connection. I told myself this was just what marriage turned into after enough years. But my body knew before my mind did. I started feeling tense all the time, tight shoulders, restless sleep, that constant low-grade anxiety that something wasn't right even when nothing was technically wrong. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being married and still feeling alone. It messes with your head. You start thinking maybe you're the problem, maybe you're asking for too much, maybe you're ungrateful. I remember one specific moment, years before he left. We were at a party with friends. I watched him laugh with everyone else, animated, relaxed, fully present, and when I tried to join the conversation, he barely acknowledged me, like I was just there. I smiled through it. Of course I did. On the drive home, I wanted to say something. My chest felt tight, like the words were pressing against my ribs, but I didn't. I stared out the window and told myself I was overthinking it, that I shouldn't ruin a good night. That was the pattern. I always chose silence over discomfort, and slowly that silence became the foundation of our marriage. By the time the kids were older, we were basically roommates, polite, efficient, distant. We talked about schedules and bills and groceries, not dreams, not fears, not us. I tried to reconnect in small ways, suggesting date nights, asking deeper questions, reaching for his hand. Sometimes he'd go along with it, but it felt forced, like he was checking a box, and that hurt worse than rejection, because it told me he didn't miss me the way I missed him. I started to feel embarrassed for wanting more, like I was being childish. I told myself to grow up, to be grateful. Plenty of women had it worse, right? But pain isn't a competition, and neglect still hurts, even if it's quiet. As the years went on, I stopped trying as much. Not consciously, it just happened. You can only knock on a closed door so many times before you stop expecting it to open. I poured myself into the kids, into the house, into being useful. If I stayed busy enough, I didn't have to feel the ache. From the outside, we probably looked fine, stable, solid, 40 years together. People admired that. They said things like, "You guys are goals." I'd smile and thank them, feeling like a fraud. Because what they didn't see was how small I'd made myself to keep things running smoothly, how many needs I'd buried, how often I told myself, this is just how it is. And then one day, decades later, he stood in the kitchen and told me he wanted peace. And suddenly, all those swallowed words came rushing back. All the moments I'd chosen silence over truth, all the times I'd protected the marriage at the expense of myself, all the years I'd believed that if I just loved harder, stayed calmer, asked for less, I'd be enough. What he never said, but what I finally understood, was that my silence hadn't saved us. It had slowly erased me. And that realization hurt almost as much as him leaving, because it meant that I had been complicit in my own disappearance. I wasn't just abandoned at 60. I had been abandoning myself for decades. And now I had to figure out how to stop. I didn't wake up the next day suddenly strong or enlightened. That's not how it works. Real change doesn't crash into your life with fireworks. It creeps in slowly, usually after you've been brought to your knees. And at 60, on the other side of a 40-year marriage, I felt weak in a way I'd never allowed myself to feel before. Part of me wanted him back. I won't lie about that. I wanted the familiar weight of him in the house, even if it came with the silence. I wanted the routine, the predictability, the illusion of being chosen. Losing him felt like losing gravity. Everything floated, and I didn't know what was up or down anymore. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message. Something simple. I made a mistake. Can we talk? Anything that would tell me this wasn't really happening. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing. That silence hurt more than the leaving. I started noticing how often I'd lived my life waiting for permission, permission to speak, permission to rest, permission to want something for myself. Even now, alone in my own house, I caught myself hesitating before doing things, like I was still checking in with someone who wasn't there. One morning, I stood in the kitchen staring at the coffee maker, realizing I didn't actually know how I liked my coffee. I'd been making it his way for so long that my own preference had disappeared. That realization hit me harder than I expected. It felt ridiculous to cry over coffee, but it wasn't about coffee. It was about how thoroughly I'd erased myself. I started therapy because I didn't know what else to do. Sitting in that room, being asked what I wanted, felt almost embarrassing. The words didn't come easily. I was used to explaining, accommodating, minimizing. Saying, I don't know, became my default answer. My therapist told me something that stuck with me. She said, you learn to survive by being agreeable. And for the first time, I understood that survival and happiness aren't the same thing. There were days I was angry, furious actually, at him, at myself, at the years I couldn't get back. I'd replay conversations in my head and imagine saying everything I never said. Sometimes I'd speak out loud to an empty room, my voice shaking with all the things I'd swallowed. And then the anger would fade into sadness, deep, heavy sadness, the kind that sits in your chest and makes everything feel slow. I mourned the life I thought I'd have, growing old together, quiet evenings, shared memories. That future was gone, and I had to grieve it like a death. People around me didn't always know what to say. Some told me I was strong, some told me I'd be fine, some told me maybe it was for the best. They meant well, but none of it helped. Strength wasn't what I needed permission to fall apart. So I let myself. I cried in the shower, in the car, in the grocery store parking lot. I cried over old photos and stupid commercials and songs that reminded me of nothing in particular. I cried because I was exhausted from being the strong one. And slowly, in between the grief, small moments of clarity started to appear. I realized how much energy I'd spent managing everyone else's emotions, how much of my life had been shaped around keeping things smooth. I started to see how that habit had followed me everywhere, not just in my marriage, but in friendships, in family dynamics, in the way I treated myself. I had learned to disappear so well that I didn't even notice when I did it. One afternoon, I was sorting through old boxes in the garage, looking for something completely unrelated, when I came across journals from my 20s and 30s. I sat on the floor and started reading. The woman in those pages had opinions, desires, frustrations, dreams. She wasn't quiet. She wasn't invisible. I barely recognized her. That broke my heart in a new way. I wondered what would have happened if I'd listened to her more, if I'd trusted my discomfort instead of silencing it, if I'd believed my needs mattered as much as anyone else's. But regret is a dangerous place to live. You can drown in it if you're not careful. I had to learn to look at my past without letting it swallow me whole. At 60, I didn't have the luxury of pretending time was endless, but I also didn't want to spend what I had left punishing myself. I had to figure out how to move forward without losing myself again. That's when I started doing small, almost laughably small things for myself, saying no when I wanted to say no, ordering what I actually wanted at restaurants, speaking up when something didn't sit right. Each time felt uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that hadn't been broken in yet. But with each small act, something inside me grew steadier. I wasn't healed, not even close. Some days I still missed him. Some days I still wondered if I'd been too much or not enough. Healing isn't linear, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. But I was changing. I was starting to understand that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of self-respect, and I had gone most of my life without it. The truth was, he didn't just leave me at 60. His leaving forced me to finally meet myself, and that meeting was painful, awkward, and long overdue. I didn't know yet where this new path would lead. I didn't know who I'd become without the role I'd played for decades. But I knew one thing. I couldn't go back to the woman who disappeared to keep others comfortable. That woman had carried me as far as she could. Now it was time to walk on my own. I didn't announce my transformation to anyone. There was no big speech, no dramatic reinvention. I was still the same woman on the outside. Same face in the mirror, same house, same last name. But inside, something had shifted, and once that shift happens, there's no going back to sleep. The loneliness didn't disappear just because I started paying attention to myself. Some nights it sat beside me like an unwanted guest, but it felt different now, less desperate, less like I was being abandoned, and more like I was finally sitting still long enough to hear my own thoughts. I started noticing how quiet my life had become without his moods filling the space. There was no one to tiptoe around anymore, no one whose silence I had to decode. At first, that felt unsettling. Then it felt peaceful. Not the kind of peace he talked about, a quieter, sturdier kind. Friends started checking in more, some I hadn't been close to in years. It was strange how many people admitted they'd sensed something was off in my marriage, but didn't know how to say it. I smiled and nodded, even though part of me wanted to scream, "Why didn't anyone tell me it was okay to want more?" But the truth is, no one could have convinced me back then. I had to learn it myself. I started spending time alone on purpose. That was new. Before, being alone always felt like waiting. Now it felt like choosing. I took long walks without a destination, sat in coffee shops with no one expecting me to hurry. I listened to music I liked instead of whatever filled the silence. And slowly, I began to notice things about myself that had been buried. I liked mornings. I liked quiet. I liked writing, even if no one ever read it. I liked not explaining myself. That scared me too, because if I liked this version of my life, what did that say about the one I'd worked so hard to keep intact? There were moments guilt crept in, guilt for not missing him enough, guilt for enjoying the calm, guilt for feeling lighter. 40 years doesn't just disappear because someone walks out. Loyalty leaves fingerprints everywhere. I ran into him once, unexpectedly, at the grocery store. I wasn't prepared. He looked older, tired in a way that wasn't physical. We exchanged polite hellos, talked about the kids, the weather, nothing important. He seemed restless, like someone who thought peace would fix everything and was still waiting for it to show up. I walked away shaking, but also strangely grounded. I realized I wasn't desperate to pull him back into my life. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted to go home. That surprised me. Later that night, I sat with that feeling, the fact that I could see him and still choose myself. That was new. That was progress. I thought a lot about how we talk about love, how we praise endurance and sacrifice without asking who's paying the price, how women are taught to be grateful for being chosen, even if it costs them their voice. I had confused loyalty with self-erasure. I thought staying made me noble. I didn't realize it was slowly draining me. That doesn't mean leaving would have been easy. I don't rewrite history to make myself the hero. I stayed because I loved him, because I believed in what we built, because I was afraid of what life would look like without him. All of that can be true at the same time. But love shouldn't require you to disappear. The more I said that out loud, the more it settled into my bones. I started setting boundaries in small, awkward ways, saying no to things I didn't want to do, letting people be disappointed, not rushing to fix everyone's feelings. It felt selfish at first. Then it felt honest. There was a moment months after he left when I caught myself laughing out loud alone in the kitchen, not a polite chuckle, a real laugh. It startled me. I realized I hadn't heard that sound from myself in a long time. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just surviving, I was reclaiming. I still had bad days, days when the weight of 40 years pressed down on me, days when I wondered if I'd wasted my life, days when the future felt too open, too uncertain. Healing doesn't erase the past. It teaches you how to carry it without letting it crush you. At 61, I wasn't interested in pretending anymore. Not about my pain, not about my mistakes, not about what I wanted now. I didn't want to be impressive. I wanted to be real. I started speaking more honestly with my kids, not turning their father into a villain, but also not protecting him at my expense. I told them the truth in age-appropriate ways, that sometimes love isn't enough, that staying quiet doesn't save a marriage, that self-respect matters. They listened, and in their listening, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. I don't know what my next chapter looks like. I don't have a 5-year plan, but for the first time in decades, that doesn't terrify me. It feels like possibility instead of emptiness. I stayed married for 40 years. He left me at 60 for peace. And somewhere in the middle of losing him, I stopped losing myself. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came quietly in moments I almost missed. But once you feel it, you don't forget it. And I was just beginning to understand how much more of myself was left to meet. The funny thing about changing quietly is this. People still notice. They don't know what shifted, they just feel it. I started getting comments like, "You seem different. You look lighter. You good?" At first, I brushed it off, gave those half smiles women are trained to give. But inside, I knew exactly what they were sensing. I wasn't shrinking anymore. See, when you've spent decades bending yourself into a version that makes everyone else comfortable, the moment you stop doing that, it throws people off. Some folks cheer, others get real weird about it. And let me tell you, not everyone claps when you finally stand up straight. Some friends pulled back. Conversations got awkward. A few people who used to lean on me heavy suddenly didn't call as much. Turns out when you stop overgiving, the takers feel it first. That hurt. I won't sugarcoat it. I'd spent years being the reliable one, the listener, the fixer, the one who showed up no matter what. And now that I wasn't bending over backward, I saw who valued me and who valued what I did for them. That realization stung like hell. But it also woke me up. I stopped explaining myself, stopped over-justifying my choices, stopped saying sorry when I wasn't wrong. That was a hard habit to break. Sorry had been my default setting for decades. Now, if I didn't want to go, I didn't go. If I was tired, I rested. If something didn't sit right, I trusted that feeling. No more gaslighting myself. I noticed my body responding first. My shoulders weren't constantly tight. I slept deeper, ate slower, breathed fuller. Turns out, peace isn't loud. It shows up in your nervous system. Then came the guilt waves, the hit out of nowhere. I'd be folding laundry or driving alone, and suddenly my chest would tighten. That old voice would creep in. "You're being selfish. You should check on him. This isn't who you are." But here's what I finally realized. That voice wasn't my conscience. It was conditioning. I wasn't selfish. I was just no longer self-abandoning. Big difference. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was him. Just a simple message, "Hope you're doing okay." Months ago, that text would have wrecked me. I would have read it 10 times, overanalyzed every word, wondered what it meant, wondered if this was the door reopening. This time, I read it once. I felt nothing dramatic, no rush, no panic, no hope spirals, just a calm awareness. I replied politely, brief, kind, honest, and then I put my phone down and kept living my day. That's when it hit me. The emotional grip was loosening, not because I hated him, not because I erased the past, but because I had finally stepped back into myself. There's a moment in healing nobody warned you about. It's when you realize you're no longer waiting for someone to choose you because you already did. That moment is powerful and terrifying. Because once you choose yourself, there's no unseeing the truth. I started looking back at my marriage differently, not rewriting it, not demonizing it, just seeing it clearly. The love, the effort, the imbalance, the silence, the ways I made myself smaller to keep the peace. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. And waking up at 61 comes with mixed emotions. Regret tries to sneak in. If only I'd known sooner. If only I'd spoken up. If only I'd chosen myself earlier. But I shut that down fast, because here's the truth nobody says out loud. You wake up when you're ready, not when the world tells you to. And I was ready now. I didn't know where this road led. I just knew I wasn't turning back. For the first time in decades, my life wasn't about holding something together. It was about discovering who I was when no one was pulling me apart. After the chaos settles, after the shock wears off, after the world stops asking you how you're holding up, something strange happens. It gets quiet. Not the peaceful kind at first. I mean the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little thing you used to drown out. The hum of the fridge at night, the clock ticking too loud, your own thoughts finally getting a mic. That silence used to scare me. For 40 years, my life had noise in it. Conversations that went nowhere, compromises I didn't agree with, unspoken resentment sitting heavy in the room. Even when we weren't talking, there was still tension, a low-grade emotional static I'd learned to live with. Now, that static was gone, and in its place was space. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone just to feel connected to something, scrolling mindlessly, watching shows I wasn't even into, anything to avoid sitting alone with myself too long. Because when you finally stop running, everything you've been carrying shows up at once. The grief wasn't dramatic. It was sneaky. It came in waves. Some days I felt strong, grounded, almost proud. Other days I'd tear up in the grocery store because I saw an older couple laughing over apples and thought, that was supposed to be us. I let myself feel it. That was new. Before, I'd swallow emotions whole and call it strength. Now I was learning that strength looks like honesty, even when it's messy. I'd talk to myself out loud sometimes. Sounds crazy, but it helped. I'd say things like, you're allowed to be sad, or you didn't fail, the situation failed you, or you don't have to rush healing. No one teaches you how to grieve a marriage that didn't end in flames. There was no big betrayal story I could point to, no single villain moment, just years of slow erosion. That kind of loss messes with your head. People would say, at least it wasn't abusive, or you still have your health, or better late than never. They meant well, but those comments landed flat, because grief doesn't care about comparisons. I wasn't just grieving him, I was grieving the version of me that believed love meant endurance. I started revisiting old memories, not to torture myself, but to understand. Moments I'd brushed off back then suddenly made sense. The times I swallowed words, the times I chose peace over truth, the times I convinced myself I was asking for too much when I was really just asking to be seen. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about clarity. One night, I sat on my couch with the lights off, no TV, no phone, just me and the dark. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never dared to ask before. What do I actually want now? Not what I should want, not what looks good on paper, not what makes others comfortable. What do I want? The answer didn't come right away, and that was okay, because for decades, my wants had been on mute. I started small. I wanted mornings without rushing. I wanted conversations that felt real. I wanted laughter without walking on eggshells. I wanted to feel like my presence mattered. Simple stuff, human stuff. And slowly, that quiet stopped feeling empty. It started feeling honest. I rearranged my living space. Nothing fancy, just moved things around until it felt like mine. Threw out stuff I kept out of obligation, kept what brought comfort. Bought a plant, then another. Watching something grow under your care does something to you. It reminds you that life doesn't end because one chapter closed. It adapts. And so was I. I realized I wasn't lonely the way I thought I'd be. I was alone, yes, but not abandoned. There's a difference. Loneliness is feeling unseen. Aloneness can be sacred if you let it. I was finally seeing myself. And once you see yourself clearly, you can't unsee it. That quiet, it wasn't the absence of love. It was the space where self-respect started to take root. There's a point in healing that nobody talks about. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. There's no music playing in the background. It's just the moment you realize you're not checking behind you anymore. I noticed it one afternoon while I was out running errands. Just normal stuff. Groceries, the bank, picking up a prescription. The kind of day that used to feel heavy for no reason at all. Except this time, it didn't. I wasn't replaying old conversations in my head. I wasn't wondering what he was doing. I wasn't imagining different endings. I was just present. And that's when it hit me. I had stopped living in reaction mode. For years, my emotions were tied to someone else's moods, choices, and silence. If he was distant, I felt anxious. If he was calm, I relaxed. My inner world was always adjusting to accommodate his. Now, that cord had finally been cut. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just with clarity. I realized I didn't miss him the way I thought I did. I missed the idea of being chosen, of being partnered, of feeling secure. But security built on self-erasure isn't security at all. It's survival. I started saying things out loud that used to feel forbidden, like I deserved more, or I wasn't asking for too much, or love shouldn't make you disappear. And instead of guilt, I felt relief. That's how you know you're telling the truth. I stopped romanticizing the past, stopped polishing memories to make them easier to swallow. I saw the good and the painful side by side, and somehow that made the whole story less heavy because it was real. One evening, I ran into someone who knew us as a couple. They smiled awkwardly, tilted their head, and said, "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry." I thanked them. And then they added, "You must be heartbroken." I paused because the answer wasn't simple anymore. "I was," I said, "but I'm also okay." They looked surprised, maybe even confused, and I get it. Society loves a devastated woman. It understands grief. It knows how to respond to heartbreak. But a woman who loses a marriage and finds herself instead, that makes people uncomfortable. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't chasing revenge. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just done explaining myself. I started making plans again, small ones at first, a weekend trip, a class I'd always wanted to take, lunch with someone who made me laugh without effort. And here's the wild part. I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was starting true. At 61, I finally understood something younger me never could. You don't lose years by staying too long. You lose years by refusing to learn from them. My past didn't disappear. It became my foundation. Every compromise taught me what I needed. Every silence showed me what I'd tolerate. Every tear pointed me toward what mattered. And I carried that wisdom forward, not as baggage, as power. I stopped waiting for closure, stopped hoping for apologies that might never come. Closure isn't something someone gives you, it's something you claim, and I had claimed mine. That was the moment I stopped looking back. Not because the past stopped mattering, but because the future finally did. At some point, the pain stops being the main character. It doesn't disappear completely, it just stops running the show. I didn't wake up one day feeling healed. Healing doesn't work like that. It's quieter, slower. It sneaks up on you while you're busy living. I noticed it in the way I talked about my past. Less edge, less apology, more truth. I wasn't telling the story to be understood anymore. I was telling it because it was mine. At 61, I finally understood how much energy I'd spent trying to be palatable, trying to be easy to love, trying to not rock the boat. I'd been taught that a good woman keeps things smooth, keeps things together, keeps herself last. And for a long time, I wore that like a badge of honor. Now I see it for what it was, conditioning disguised as virtue. Love isn't proven by how much you endure. Commitment isn't measured by how much of yourself you give up. And staying isn't the same thing as being chosen. I wish someone had told me that earlier, but maybe I wouldn't have listened. We hear things when we're ready, not a moment before. I don't blame my younger self anymore. She did the best she could with what she knew. She loved deeply. She showed up. She tried. That counts. What hurts isn't that I stayed. What hurts is how long I believed silence was normal. If you're listening to this and you feel unseen in your own relationship, I need you to hear me clearly. That feeling matters. You're not dramatic. You're not needy. You're not asking for too much. You're asking the wrong person. That realization changes everything. I stopped measuring my worth by someone else's capacity to love me. Some people simply don't have the tools, and no amount of patience on your part can build something they never learned to use. That's not cruelty, that's reality. Today, my life is quieter, but it's also fuller. My days aren't packed, but they're intentional. I choose what drains me and what feeds me. And for the first time, I don't feel guilty about choosing myself. I still believe in love. I haven't closed that door, but I believe in a different kind now, one that doesn't require shrinking, one that doesn't make peace at the cost of truth. If love shows up again, it will meet me where I stand, not where I disappear. That's the difference. I no longer chase validation. I don't need to prove I'm worthy of care. I know who I am now, and that knowing, it's unshakable. When he said he left for peace, I thought it meant he found something I couldn't give him. I thought peace was a place, a person, a quieter version of life without me in it. I was wrong. Peace isn't running away. Peace isn't silence that avoids truth. Peace isn't leaving someone who kept showing up. Real peace doesn't come from escape. It comes from alignment. And it took me 61 years to understand that. Peace is waking up without that tight feeling in your chest. Peace is not rehearsing conversations that will never happen. Peace is not begging to be chosen by someone who already decided not to see you. Peace is knowing you didn't abandon yourself today. My life now doesn't look impressive on paper. There's no big reveal, no dramatic glow-up, no fairy tale ending wrapped in a bow. But it's honest. I wake up and check in with myself first. I speak when something matters to me. I rest without apologizing. I leave situations that drain me, quietly, without explanation. And that alone changed everything. Sometimes I think about the woman I was at 40 or 50. I wish I could sit beside her, take her hand, and tell her this. You don't have to earn love by disappearing. You're allowed to take up space. Being chosen should not feel like survival. But life doesn't work backward. So instead, I say it now, out loud, for anyone listening who feels stuck in silence, loyalty, or fear of starting over. You are not behind. You are not too old. You are not foolish for hoping. You are allowed to change. I didn't lose 40 years. I lived them. I learned from them. And I walked away with wisdom I wouldn't trade for anything. He went looking for peace. I built mine. And the difference is, mine didn't require leaving myself behind. If this story found you at a moment where you're questioning your worth, your patience, or your place in someone else's life, let it be a reminder. Staying is not always strength. Endurance is not always love. And choosing yourself is not failure. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you'll ever do. This is Mabel. I'm 61 years old, and my life didn't end when my marriage did. It finally began.